how ancient Persians refrigerated dessert in the desert. You lie down, eyes heavy, and think of the desert. Not the shimmering kind of mirage in motion, but the kind that barely breathes, the kind where wind rustles through nothing, and even silence has its own temperature. This is where our story begins, in the harsh, arid plateau of ancient Persia, modern-day Iran, more than 2,000 years ago. But rather than heat, we begin with cold. Ice, to be exact. Imagine ice, delicate, fleeting, and ephemeral, stored not for survival, but for pleasure, for dessert. In the searing heart of Persia, where daytime temperatures soared above 100 degrees and water evaporated faster than it could be fetched, the ancient Persians were cooling sorbets and storing blocks of ice through the heat of summer, and they did it without electricity, compressors, or freon. They used yakhchals, structures as ordinary to their citizens as a pantry is to you, and yet staggeringly ingenious in design. The yakhchal, the ancient freezer. The word yakhchal translates literally to ice pit, and it's as blunt a description as it is accurate. These ancient refrigerators were massive beehive-shaped domes, some rising over 60 feet high, made of a special mortar called saruj, a mixture of clay, egg whites, ash, lime, and goat hair. Waterproof and impenetrable, their outer form was designed not for aesthetics, but for thermodynamic perfection. The conical shape allowed warm air to rise naturally and vent out through the top, while the thick walls insulated the interior from desert heat. But the brilliance was not just in the insulation. It was in how they filled them. Ice in the desert, a winter harvest. In the colder months, Persian engineers would divert water from qanats, underground aqueducts, into shallow channels or pools that ran alongside the yakhchal. The pools were oriented to maximize exposure to the cold night air while minimizing sunlight. Often, tall walls would be built to cast long shadows and protect the ice from early thaw. As night fell and temperatures dipped below freezing, a thin sheet of ice would form on the surface of the water. Workers would rise before dawn and carefully skim the ice off, stacking it deep inside the yakhchal's subterranean chamber. Night after night, this delicate ritual repeated, layering ice like the pages of a thick frozen book. It was laborious, it was slow, and it was somehow worth it, because by the time the sun beat down on the earth in July, the people of ancient Persia could walk into the cool belly of a yakhchal and retrieve what would to many seem like a miracle: cold dessert. The cold chain. Why it mattered to truly appreciate the brilliance of the yakhchal. Consider this. Modern refrigeration was only invented in the 19th century. Before that, every civilization that wanted cold storage had to engage in an uphill battle against entropy, using the tools of architecture, science, and persistence. But Persia didn't just win that battle. They institutionalized it. Ice was stored for months, allowing wealthy elites to enjoy faluda, an early kind of sorbet made with thin vermicelli noodles, rose water, and syrup. It was sweet, floral, and best served cold, but this wasn't merely culinary decadence. The ice also served a practical purpose: preserving food and providing cool relief for the sick during the oppressive summer. The yakhchal was more than a cooler. It was a climate technology, a symbol of social organization, and a demonstration of human persistence. And it all relied on a delicate interplay of environmental knowledge and architectural precision. The geometry of cool. Let's pause to reflect on the conical structure itself. At first glance, the design seems obvious. Hot air rises, so you give it room to escape. But here's the subtlety. The dome narrowed at the top not only to vent hot air but to slow its motion. This reduced turbulent mixing, limiting heat penetration into the core. Inside, the base chamber sank deep below ground level, sometimes over 6 meters down, taking advantage of the Earth's thermal inertia. Soil stays cool, even when the surface, scorches. The ancients may not have known the mathematical term heat capacity, but they mastered its application. Sarouge, that dull-sounding mortar, is another example of boring brilliance. It was mixed not just to resist water but to expand and contract with minimal cracking. A cracked yakchal would leak and melt its contents. Centuries-old yakchals still stand today, proof that the mixture held. But perhaps most impressive of all is what they didn't do. They didn't try to cool the world. They worked with it. By understanding the rhythms of temperature, airflow, and night versus day, the Persians built a passive, zero-energy refrigeration system that endured for centuries. The role of qanats yet. No story of a yakchal is complete without mentioning the qanat. These underground channels, some stretching dozens of miles, brought water from mountain aquifers to desert cities with barely any loss to evaporation. Qanats, too, were marvels of engineering. Workers dug vertical shafts, sometimes over 100 feet deep, to create a sloped tunnel that let gravity carry water slowly and steadily. In the cold season, this water could be redirected to the freezing pools near the yakchal. In the hot months, it provided the minimal meltwater needed to cool internal temperatures through controlled evaporation. Together, the qanat and the yakchal formed a system, one that cooled not only deserts, but also mines, cities, and possibilities. A community effort. The building and maintenance of a yakchal were no solo endeavor. Whole communities were involved. Seasonal ice collectors, qanat diggers, mortar mixers, and water managers all played a role. These weren't heroic figures of epic tales. They were workers, craftsmen, engineers, and bureaucrats. In many cities, the local government regulated water usage, ice collection, and storage rights. Inscriptions on old yakchals reference waqf, charitable endowments, indicating that some ice storage was maintained for the public good, a reserve for the sick, for travelers, for charity. And so the story becomes not just one of clever engineering, but one of collaboration, of community. The desert did not permit individualism. Survival was collective, from ice to silence. So here we are, in the middle of a lifeless desert, sitting quietly inside a cool dome, surrounded by the muffled hush of snow that hasn't melted. No fan hums, no motor runs. And yet, your drink is cold, and you begin to wonder if they could store ice in the desert 2,000 years ago. What other forgotten technologies might have once shaped the world quietly, invisibly, just beneath the surface? The moon has passed its peak in the sky, and in the cool dark, the yakchal still holds its breath. We return now not just to the structure itself, but to the people, those who designed, maintained, and benefited from this quiet miracle of thermodynamics. In this section, we look deeper, how the knowledge behind the yakchal system was created, protected, and passed on. How engineering, water politics, and empire intertwined to preserve coldness in a place defined by heat. To understand this, we have to look at the people who moved silently through the backbone of the Persian Empire. Not generals, not kings, but engineers, water managers, and mathematicians. The engineers without names. There are no famous architects associated with the invention of the yakchal. No Heron of Alexandria, no Vitruvius. Most of the technology was passed along orally or through local traditions, master to apprentice, father to son. Inscriptions, if any, are rarely personal. Instead, they describe land usage, donations, and material costs. From these records, we gather that engineering was not only highly respected, but deeply embedded in Persian administrative life. Even in the time of Cyrus the Great in the 6th century BCE, the Persian Empire recognized the value of sustainable infrastructure. A well-functioning, City was one that managed water invisibly. A yakshal, tucked behind thick city walls, was often unremarked upon. Its brilliance was measured not in show but in silence, cooling the empire. The Persian Empire at its height stretched from the Indus Valley to the Aegean Sea. Across this vast domain, climatic conditions varied wildly, but central Iran remained, the symbolic and administrative heart. Here, with its dry plateau and scorching summers, water management was a civilizational necessity. Persepolis, the ceremonial capital of the empire, shows signs of advanced water systems: cisterns, stone, aqueducts, subterranean canals. No yakchals have been directly linked to the city, but the principles of their construction, shadow orientation, thermal mass, airflow, are mirrored in its design. Likewise, in Yazd, a city that sits on the edge of the Dashti Kavir Desert, dozens of ancient yakchals still stand. Many are defunct, their saruj cracked, their interiors now homes to dust and pigeons. But the structures remain remarkably preserved, and their location suggests centralized urban planning. They were built into the layout of the city. That tells us something important. Ice storage wasn't a quirky innovation. It was embedded in the rhythms of city life. It was, in its own slow and deliberate way, part of imperial cohesion, Khanat. Keepers and water jurists. While the yakchal stored ice, it was the Khanat that made it possible, and with the Khanat came an entirely different class of specialists, the Mukhanis. A Mukhani was more than a ditch digger. They were geometers, chemists, and practical philosophers of the underground. Trained from childhood, they learned to measure, slopes by eye, to detect subtle changes in soil texture and moisture, and to predict the presence of subterranean aquifers. A mistaken angle could mean disaster, too steep, and water would rush too quickly and erode the channel. Too shallow and the water would stagnate, or worse, evaporate before reaching the surface. The math involved was rarely written down, but passed through generations. A successful Mukhani could become quite wealthy, even revered. Some were invited from region to consult, and their prestige sometimes rivaled religious leaders. And yet, the legal aspect of water was just as complex. Enter the water jurists, local officials responsible for mediating disputes over water rights. Because the Khanat system passed through private and public land, access had to be strictly regulated. These jurists would consult old land records, often carved into stone or clay, to determine who had the right to collect water, and by extension, ice. They oversaw everything from crop irrigation quotas to seasonal freezing schedules near the yakchal. It sounds bureaucratic, and it was, but in a desert, bureaucracy saved lives. Ice as wealth, ice as status, while ice was at times shared. For public health or charitable purposes, it also became a marker of class. Access to the lower chambers of a yakchal was controlled. Servants would be sent before dawn to collect ice for their masters, often stored in leather bags lined with straw. The elite could host gatherings even in July with chilled drinks or fruit cooled by shaved ice. A bowl of falude, with its syrupy rosewater and slivers of lemon, might seem simple, but its temperature whispered of control over nature. And in a society where nature so often dictated hardship, control was the most precious luxury. Interestingly, ice storage also played a role in diplomacy. Accounts suggest that when foreign, Dignitaries visited from wetter climates, they were often impressed, not by gold, not by armies, but by ice. That the Persians could offer a chilled dessert in a desert was both delightful and unsettling. This impression was by design. The forgotten sustainability. What's striking about this entire system is how modern it feels, even as it contrasts completely. With our modern methods, there were no fossil fuels, no machinery, no pollution. The Yakchal did not disturb the environment, it collaborated with it. Even its building materials were local: clay, straw, ash. Nothing synthetic. Nothing imported. The entire cooling system, from the qanat to the freezing channels to the Yakchal, was circular. Water was diverted, frozen, stored, melted, and returned. Labor was seasonal. Maintenance was communal. Decisions were legal and deliberate. Compare that with our current refrigeration systems, which depend on global supply chains, non-renewable energy, and environmentally damaging coolants. The Yakchal was not just a green refrigerator. It was a philosophy in mud, brick, and ice. Migration of knowledge over time. The knowledge of ice storage migrated, both eastward and westward. Evidence shows that similar domed ice houses were built in China during the Tang and Song dynasties, though their construction differed slightly. In the Islamic world, particularly during the Abbasid Caliphate, records of Persian engineering were translated into Arabic and passed on. By the time of the Mughal Empire, ice and cold drinks were a central part of courtly life in India. Much of the technology behind it, insulating pits, early evaporative coolers, was imported from Persian tradition. Later still, in the 17th century, European travelers wrote about Persian yakchals with curiosity and a touch of disbelief. Some refused to believe the stories until they saw the structures themselves. Yet despite this global diffusion, few of the names of these ancient engineers survive. Their legacy isn't in a single invention, but in a system of knowledge, a system that lived quietly beneath the sand and stone. Modern lessons, forgotten practices today. A few Iranian architects and historians are trying to revive passive cooling techniques, particularly in eco-conscious design. Some sustainable housing projects in hot climates are borrowing from Yakchal geometry, conical shapes, thick walls, and subterranean storage. Yet many of these projects face resistance, not because they don't work, but because they're seen as primitive. It's a strange irony. We prize technology that requires energy and noise, but dismiss the kind that operates silently and without waste. The ancient Persians did not care if their system looked modern. They cared if it worked. So as the wind moves softly over the desert tonight, brushing the broken edges of an old yakchal, one must ask, how much have we lost by forgetting the quiet technologies of the past? The sun creeps above the horizon in the city of Yazd. Shadows retract slowly across a pale courtyard. At the center, a crumbling conical structure leans into the morning, its surface scabbed with time and wind. This is one of the last standing yakchals still tethered to memory, not just as an architectural relic, but as a place once thick with activity. Silent labor before dawn, ropes creaking, ice lowered into the cool belly of the earth. Now, in this final section, we follow the quiet decline of this ancient technology, not with drama but with patience. We look at the slow unraveling of a brilliant system and what its disappearance tells us about the passage of civilizations, a system with no urgency. Unlike many ancient innovations that were wiped out by conquest or fire, the Yakchal did not. fall all at once. It was not conquered. It was outpaced. The decay began with subtle changes, new trade routes, urban expansion, and above all, modern refrigeration. By the early 20th century, electric coolers became available in larger cities, like Tehran and Isfahan. Imported from Europe or manufactured locally, these machines offered something that the Yakhchal could not. Instant cold. No need to wait for winter. No need to dig canals. No need to depend on seasonal weather. You plugged the machine in and the cold came to you. It was seductive in its convenience. It was progress wrapped in wires. Yakhchals, with their slow cycles and quiet laws, felt like the past. And in a rapidly modernizing Iran, the past was not always a welcome companion, the echoes of ice. And yet, in rural places, Kerman, Tabbas, 9, the Yakhchal lingered. For many villagers, electricity came late, and fuel was expensive. Old ice pits remained in use well into the 1950s and 60s, often maintained by small aging teams who still remembered how to seal the sarouj and manage airflow through the flues. There were still freezing nights, still desert winds, still people who knew the language of earth and slope. One man, Reza Lotfi, born in the 1920s in the Yazd province, recalled in an interview that his job as a child was to wake at 3 a.m. and check the ice film in the channels. He would brush off dust and debris and gently measure the thickness of the sheet before deciding if it was ready to break and carry to storage. It was a silent job, he said. You had to listen to the wind. You had to smell the water. You couldn't be in a hurry. By the 1970s, his Yakhchal was abandoned. The canal that fed it was filled in. The pit became a trash heap and eventually a parking lot. When asked how he felt about it, he smiled without bitterness. Things change, he said, but that cold, it was ours. No one gave it to us. We made it. Cultural memory in mud brick today. Many Yakhchals still stand, but more as skeletons than as machines. Their presence is acknowledged in local heritage programs, and a few have been preserved as tourist sites or cultural museums. Yet very few people alive today know how to build one from scratch. In Yazd, the city with perhaps the most surviving examples, efforts are being made to integrate Yakhchal principles into modern architecture. Passive cooling, thick walls, and wind towers, once ignored, are now being studied by environmental engineers seeking sustainable alternatives. There is something poetic in this, that the Yakhchal may not return as it was, but may return in spirit, recycled into forms more acceptable to modern sensibilities. But can technology ever be truly separated from the culture that birthed it? To understand the Yakhchal is not just to replicate its shape. It is to understand the seasonal rhythm, the communal labor, the legal and spiritual relationship with water. It is to accept that sometimes the best technology is not the fastest, but the one most in tune with the land. The ice beneath empire, as with so many ancient technologies, the deeper meaning of the Yakhchal lies not in its function, but in its symbolism. It is a testament to patience, foresight, and collective will. It represents a society that did not seek to dominate nature through brute force, but to work with it subtly, over time. That lesson is more urgent now than ever. In an age of climate change, dwindling resources, and ecological fatigue, there is something almost rebellious in turning to mud, wind, and silence as tools of survival. Persia, often remembered for its poets and emperors, also deserves to be remembered for its engineers of cold. They worked in the margins of maps, beneath palaces, beyond the scrolls of court historians, and yet their work lasted longer than any king's decree. Their ice was invisible until it touched the tongue. The last cold breath let us end then, in the stillness of a forgotten desert morning. Imagine stepping into the mouth of an old Yakhchal. The air is thick, dry, and surprisingly cool. You descend into the dome's shadow. The world above falls silent. The clay walls breathe around you, steady and ancient. There is no light but what you carry, no sound but your own breath. You touch the wall, rough but clean. And in that moment, you realize you are not inside a ruin. You are inside an idea, a living memory of how humans once survived, not with dominance, but with understanding. And as you step back out into the heat, blinking into the sun, you cannot help but wonder, what other answers to our future have we buried in the dust of the past?
It's sometime in the 2nd century BCE, and you're standing inside a government office in the western provinces of Han China. The room is not grand. There are no banners or incense. There's barely enough sunlight to see the wooden writing, boards stacked along the walls. But if you could read the characters scratched onto them, you'd see the bones of an empire. Grain tallies, corvée labor orders, lists of arrowheads, field inspection reports, tax arrears, sick leave notices, mourning exemptions, and bamboo slips recording how much salt was sold last season. There is no drama here, no swordplay, no intrigue. But there is an empire, measured out in strokes of ink, weighted by clerks, with tired eyes. This is the story of how Han China became one of the most powerful and enduring civilizations in history, not through warfare or poetry, but through an avalanche of paper. And like all good bureaucracies, it started small and ended buried. The origins of an obsession after the brief but violent reign of the Qin dynasty, 221-206 BCE, which unified China but collapsed under its own rigidity. The Han emerged like a cautious heir, learning from its predecessors. Mistakes, but keeping its love of paperwork. Liu Bang, a former peasant and the first emperor of the Han dynasty, understood that an empire could not survive on charisma alone. What it needed was order, predictability, records. So the Han did what the Qin had begun. They divided the empire into districts, appointed governors, trained scribes, and sent out inspectors. But unlike the Qin, who imposed strict uniformity, from the top down, the Han allowed for local variations, so long as the paperwork balanced. This flexibility proved brilliant. It allowed the Han to administer a vast and diverse landscape, from rice fields in the south to horse pastures in the north, using a single operating system, the bureaucratic document. Most of these documents were not made of paper. Not yet. Instead, they were scratched into bamboo slips, tied with string, and bundled into scrolls. Later, wooden tablets were added for heavier records. Paper wouldn't become widespread until the 2nd century CE, but even before that, the Han were swimming in data. Life as a low-level clerk. Imagine, for a moment, that you are a scribe assigned to the office of the district magistrate in a modest provincial town. You wake before dawn. There is no ceremony. Your tools are a brush, ink, and a low bench. The room smells of dried reeds and inkstone. The clerk next to you snores, still half asleep, but already a stack of bamboo slips awaits your hand. You copy, review, annotate. A tax receipt needs transcription. A complaint about land boundaries must be entered and cross-referenced. A family requests exemption from labor service due to a recent funeral. According to custom, they are allowed 3 years of mourning, but they must prove it. Your job is not to judge, only to record. Errors are punished. Lost slips can lead to caning or worse, but mostly the work is boring, unending, and necessary. Without you, the granaries don't open, the roads don't get repaired, the soldiers don't get paid. You are a cog in a system so vast it's barely visible, but like any machine, it only works when the gears are oiled, and your ink is the oil. The frontier archive, Juyan and Dunhuang for centuries, these documents vanished into the dust. But in the 20th century, archaeologists digging in the deserts of Western China began to uncover what can only be described as the waste paper basket of empire. Near the garrisons of Juyan and Dunhuang, thousands upon thousands of bamboo and wooden slips were found, buried beneath sand and time. Most were routine memos, dating from around 100 BCE to 100 CE. They were not intended to survive. These were working documents. Notes, orders, drafts. Once copied into ledgers or deemed no longer useful, they were thrown away. Yet because the desert is dry and still, they endured. From these scraps, we now know an astonishing amount about life in Han China, not from the top down, but from the inside out. For example, a corporal at a frontier post requests more ink and brushes. A soldier is punished for losing a bowstring. A cook records the number of sheep slaughtered for rations. A garrison officer files a report on a suspicious traveler's movements. The tone is consistent, brisk, efficient, unadorned, and deeply human. There are no grand proclamations here, no Confucian moralizing, just instructions, reports, and lists. Bureaucracy, raw and unfiltered. And it is here, in these quiet fragments, that we truly begin to see how the Han governed. Bureaucracy. As infrastructure, the Roman Empire built roads. The Han Empire built systems. Yes, they had roads and walls and canals, but their greatest infrastructure was administrative. Each official had a rank, a title, and a defined scope. Promotion was possible, but only with clean records, proper training, and years of service. The meritocratic exam system would come later, during the Tang dynasty, but even now, ability mattered. Officials were required to file regular reports to higher officers. Records were copied and archived in provincial headquarters. Some were sent all the way to the capital at Chang'an. Nothing moved fast, but everything moved forward. And this is what made Han bureaucracy so powerful. It was slow, but thorough. It could absorb shocks, rebellions, famines, invasions, because its foundation was not personality, but process. Even today, some modern scholars refer to Han China as a paper state, not because it was fragile, but because it was held together by the persistent weight of documentation. Paper arrives, the silent revolution, around 105 CE. During the Eastern Han period, a man named Kai Lun, an official at the imperial court, is credited with refining the chai, process of making paper from mulberry bark, old rags, and fishnets. Paper was cheaper, lighter, and easier to produce than bamboo or wood. It was a small change that would ultimately reshape the world, but it didn't change everything overnight. In fact, for decades, centuries even, bamboo and wood continued to be used in parallel with paper. Why? Because the old methods were durable, known, and deeply embedded in administrative routines. Clerks are conservative creatures. They do not change unless ordered, but slowly, paper made inroads, first in schools, then in lower offices. Eventually, it would become the empire's default medium and the bureaucrat's best friend. And with paper came new volumes, new archives, and new vulnerabilities. Because paper burns, paper gets wet, paper decays, and so the record keeping doubled. Triple copies, redundant ledgers, duplicates sent to the capital. The bureaucracy grew, not because it had to, but because it could. By the time the Han began to fracture in the 3rd century CE, the system had become bloated. Elegant, yes, but also heavy, and that weight, over time, would become a burden. The boring power of paper. We often celebrate empires for their warriors, thinkers, and monuments, but perhaps the greatest strength of Han China was its ability to write itself into existence, to record every boundary, every bushel of rice, every name and number, not because it was interesting, but because it was essential. Through these slips and scraps, we see a state that believed in measurement, regularity, and institutional memory. It was an empire where the smallest transaction mattered, and where the future was built not just by emperors, but by anonymous hands copying line after line. And as we turn the last of these wooden slips over in our mind, we might ask, what happens when a state becomes so good at remembering, it forgets how to forget? Let's return now to the dusty halls of Han administration, not to their triumph, but to their tension. If Section 1 revealed how the Han bureaucracy expanded with discipline and purpose, this next part brings us deeper into its contradictions. What happens when systems designed for order become systems that overwhelm? When the empire grows, so does the paperwork. And beneath the neat columns of ink, beneath the reverent brushstrokes of clerks across 1,000 provinces, lies something older and more universal than any dynasty. The error, not failure necessarily, but the creeping, inevitable tide of human missteps in a system that demands perfection. The bureaucracy grows a spine, and then a labyrinth by the middle of the Western Han period, around the 1st century BCE. The empire's administrative system was a sprawling entity. It consisted of more than 100 commanderies, subdivided into over 1,000 counties. Each layer required documentation. Each report needed a copy. Each official was responsible for reviewing the work of the one beneath him. The government didn't just run, it audited itself repeatedly. This seems on the surface like an efficient way to govern, and in many respects, it was. But as with all bureaucracies, the desire for control created its own complexity. Forms multiplied, terminologies ossified, new offices emerged simply to process old ones. In some provincial commanderies, clerical staff outnumbered all other officials combined. One record from the region of Shenyang noted that more than 70% of the magistrate's monthly expenses were for clerical supplies and copyists. But despite the scale, few dared challenge the system. Why? Because paperwork offered protection. A complete file could defend an official from blame. An error blamed on a lower scribe could be smoothed over. In the Han world, to be unrecorded was to be vulnerable. Thus, bureaucracy did not merely manage the empire. It became the empire's armor and its blindfold. Mistakes in no system that relies on human labor escapes human error. Some slips uncovered from frontier outposts reveal comical yet telling mistakes. A requisition form for 10 bows was misread and delivered as 100 boats. A cook's record of grain issued for 20 men was transcribed as 200. Leading to accusations of theft. A soldier's death was recorded, then reversed, then recorded again, each time in a different hand. These were not crimes, they were misread. Characters, tired hands, worn brushes. But the consequences could be severe. One clerk in Anding was flogged for incorrectly reporting the arrival date of a shipment of salt. His superior claimed the mistake disrupted grain distributions, though records suggest the error was caught within 2 days. In more extreme cases, punishments for administrative mistakes included demotion, fines, beatings, or reassignment to remote postings. This created a culture of defensive record keeping, writing not to communicate, but to shield oneself. Officials would copy documents multiple times, attach explanatory notes, and seek witness signatures to deflect responsibility. Viamai. Result: layers upon layers of paper, and a system increasingly concerned with not being wrong rather than being right. The case of the missing Bridge 1 particularly revealing incident occurred during the reign of Emperor Zhao. R 87 to 74 BCE, involving a small wooden bridge in Hedong Commandery. The bridge, essential for transporting salt and grain shipments during spring floods, was routinely maintained by local laborers under state supervision. One year, due to unseasonal rains, the bridge collapsed before repairs could be scheduled. The incident was not catastrophic. The goods were rerouted with only minor delay, yet the paper trail it produced is staggering. Over 200 slips and wooden tablets were discovered related to the matter. These included weather reports from the preceding 2 weeks, records of labor drafts issued and withdrawn, minutes from a meeting discussing the repair timeline, an inquiry into the delay of inspection orders, a disciplinary report on the OI, bridge maintenance overseer, a rebuttal from that overseer citing misdated dispatches, a final apology letter, signed and sealed by the assistant magistrate. The bridge was eventually repaired, but the amount of administrative noise generated by the event far exceeded the physical damage. This case is not unique. Dozens of similar instances reveal a bureaucracy so intertwined with its paperwork that every small crisis created a cascade of clerical responses. The Han didn't just manage events, they documented their management of events. A quiet rebellion, a forgetting. As the Eastern Han period dawned in the 1st century CE, the system remained formidable, but cracks were appearing. Some frontier posts began to discard older records prematurely. Storage space was limited, and local officials, overwhelmed by redundant reporting, sometimes burned or buried slips to make room. One document discovered in Dunhuang includes a rare marginal note from a clerk. Too many copies, not enough hands. Who will read them? They only come when there is a mistake. It's a faint whisper of bureaucratic burnout, a feeling perhaps more universal than the bamboo it was written on. Meanwhile, some commanders began issuing oral orders to bypass the paperwork altogether. This was dangerous. Without documentation, orders could not be verified, but it was faster and it allowed for discretion. In a system built on writing, silence became resistance. These informal deviations rarely showed up in the central records, but their fingerprints are everywhere. Missing forms, altered reports, unexplained shifts in troop movements. The center, in Chang'an, believed the periphery was following the manual. The periphery, exhausted, had started improvising paper verses. People, despite all of this, the Han administration continued to function. It absorbed rebellions, managed population growth, and maintained infrastructure over a territory as vast as the Roman Empire. But as the 2nd century wore on, the sheer scale of the bureaucracy became a liability. The imperial court itself became saturated with internal documents, factional reports, and personal memorials. Every minister had a scroll. Every crisis had a dozen memos. Power became diffuse and ceremonial, not because it was shared, but because it was buried under forms. In the time, officials began to manipulate the bureaucracy for political gain. Records were selectively preserved, erased, or falsified. Entire offices were created simply to manage the paperwork of other offices. The bureaucracy, once a tool of governance, had become an end unto itself. And still, the scribes copied. Still, the ink flowed. Still, the city ate paper. Beneath the ink, a warning as we sit with these facts, not dramatic, not tragic, but strangely heavy. We start to see a deeper pattern. The Han were not brought down by fire or invasion, at least not at first. They were slowed, burdened, made brittle by the very systems that once ensured their longevity. The story here is not of failure, but of inertia. Systems that outgrow their purpose do not collapse. They calcify. They become too large to change, too complex to adapt, and in doing so, they lose the very thing they were built to preserve: human clarity. So let us return to that quiet question, written on the edge of a bamboo slip. Who will read them? In that simple doubt lies the ghost of an empire, not in its palaces or armies, but in its files. Imagine the fading twilight of the Han Empire, not in the clash of battle, not in the halls of the Forbidden City, but in the rustle of bamboo slips being sorted for the last time, here in the shadowy corners of county offices and provincial archives. The final chapter of Han bureaucracy unfolds, not with drama, but with exhaustion. It is not a collapse like a temple crushed by earthquake. It is more like a quiet abandonment, a slow peeling away of attention, discipline, and belief. The Han Empire had always been built on ink and diligence, but even paper empires crack when the hands that hold the brush begin to tremble. Let us now observe what it looks like when a system outlives its usefulness, how the clerks kept writing, even as the world around them burned. The weight of continuity. The 2nd century CE, Han China's administration had become so vast and ritualized that change itself was seen as suspicious. Innovation was not rewarded. Adherence was safety. Officials were promoted not for creativity, but for precision in copying. Correct procedure. Young scholars were trained not to imagine policy, but to recite precedents. In some exams, students were required to memorize memorials written centuries before and reproduce them character for character. Thus, the very system that had once brought governance to a continent now began to stifle it. Imagine a clerk, somewhere, in a dusty commandery office, dutifully transcribing last year's grain yields. He knows the records will be filed and likely never read. He does it anyway, because the file must be complete. There is safety in the process, but the world outside the office has begun to fray when paper meets fire. The end of the later Han was marked by unrest, peasant uprisings, famine, military revolts, and court corruption. The most famous of these, the Yellow Turban Rebellion, 184 CE, was both symptom and signal. It was a moment of rupture, a broad-based popular movement fueled by economic despair and mystical ideology. But it was also a response to a state that no longer functioned, no matter how many documents said it did. Clerks recorded troop dispatches to provinces already lost. Edicts were copied in triplicate, even as roads were impassable. Tax registers were updated, though few paid. In Luoyang, the imperial capital, civil servants still attended court during the early days of revolt, filing reports as though they could reason the violence away. Eventually, the court was forced to flee. Luoyang was burned in 190 CE, and with it, enormous libraries of records, imperial archives, regional census rolls, correspondence between provinces, genealogies, inventories, and maps. It was the largest loss of bureaucratic material in Chinese history to that point. And yet, even in exile, clerks resumed their duties. In Suchang, the new provisional capital, offices were re-established. Records were rewritten from memory or from surviving duplicates. Scribal schools resumed training. What does that tell us? That bureaucracy had become habit, a rhythm independent of logic or consequence. It was no longer about power. It was about continuity. Ghost records and fictional provinces as the central government fragmented. A strange phenomenon emerged in the documents. Phantom reports. These were bureaucratic records filed from regions no longer under imperial control. Commanderies where imperial authority had collapsed still appeared in census rolls and tax records, often with data copied from previous years. In one famous case, A record from Yu province, far to the north now under warlord control, was discovered to be an exact duplicate of a report from 5 years prior. Same numbers, same names, same formatting. Even the weather observations were identical. Why? Because to leave a blank was worse than to copy. The expectation of completeness was stronger than the expectation of truth, and so the empire continued to exist on paper long after it ceased to function on the ground. The Han became, in its final years, a fiction maintained by its clerks. The dispersal of the clerks as regional warlords seized power and created splinter states. Many bureaucrats were absorbed into new administrations. Others fled into obscurity, taking with them generations of scribal knowledge. But their influence endured. A particularly interesting example is found in the state of Wei, one of the 3 kingdoms that emerged after the Han collapse. Wei adopted many Han administrative practices wholesale, including its filing structures, its record-keeping logic, and even its terminology. Former Han clerks were in high demand. They were viewed not as loyalists to a fallen regime, but as technicians, skilled in the maintenance of order. Even amid chaos, the machinery of bureaucracy proved reusable. The Han may have died, but its methods persisted. Across the 3 kingdoms, in the Jin dynasty and beyond, the idea that governance must be written, recorded, archived became a lasting truth in Chinese statecraft. The clerk's desk remained, rebuilt, repainted, but always there. The tomb of a bureaucrat. In 1972, archaeologists unearthed a Han tomb at Wuwei in Gansu province. Inside, alongside typical burial goods, they found a perfectly preserved wooden tablet. It wasn't religious. It wasn't poetic. It was a delivery receipt for 30 bolts of cloth. This small record, buried with a low-ranking official, offers no grand insight. It isn't a manifesto or a confession, but in its plainness lies something profound. It reminds us that for Han bureaucrats, their life's work was the system. Their legacy wasn't carved in stone. It was filed in a box. To be buried with a receipt was perhaps a mark of pride. Bureaucracy. As civilization, when we consider how empires endure, we often think of roads, armies, walls. But in Han China, the true infrastructure was administrative. No other system in the ancient world, save perhaps Rome, created such a detailed, far-reaching apparatus of governance. And yet, that very detail became its vulnerability. The Han bureaucracy was never destroyed. It simply outgrew its capacity to be useful. It became more about itself than about the people it served. It became, in the end, a ritual. But perhaps that's not failure. Perhaps for a civilization so vast, where the emperor could never meet his people face to face, the act of writing was the only true connection. And so, generation after generation, scribes sat at their desks. They copied, they recorded, they filed. And though most of their work vanished, the idea behind it endured, that a society is only as strong as its memory.
Picture the Roman Empire, not as a place of emperors, gladiators, or battles, but as a network of paths, ruts, and gravel, stretching quietly across the world. Rome, more than any other empire before it, understood that conquest was not complete when the fighting ended. It was complete when you could walk from the sea to the mountains and still be on Roman ground, when you could move salt from a marsh in Ostia to a garrison in Britannia, and everyone along the way knew where to step, where to rest, and who to pay. This story is not about soldiers or politics. It is about roads, not just the straight ones, built with legionary labor, but also the dusty mule paths, the worn stones of market routes, and the slow, rhythmic sound of ox carts making their way between forgotten villages. Let's walk now along those roads, not with haste, but with the deliberate pace of a Roman merchant or courier, and see how something as mundane as a footpath helped hold together one of the largest empires in history, the Via Salaria, where it all begins. Before Rome was an empire, it was a swampy village surrounded by enemies and uneasy alliances. Long before Caesar crossed the Rubicon or Augustus claimed divinity, there was salt, and the road that carried it. The Via Salaria, or the Salt Road, was one of the earliest known Roman roads, predating the Republic. It ran from the salt flats near the Tiber River, through the Sabine Hills and into the Apennine Mountains. Salt was more than seasoning. It was preservation, currency, and necessity. And so, the people who moved it, Sabine traders and Roman carters, paved a trail that would later become infrastructure. This road, crude at first, was reinforced with stone, widened to accommodate 2 carts side by side, and eventually formalized into one of the first true Roman roads. The name salary even derives from salarium, originally thought to be the allowance given to soldiers for purchasing salt. Here is where Rome began, not in glory, but in logistics, building the bones of empire. By the height of the empire, Rome had constructed over 400,000 kilometers of roads across its territories, more than 80,000 kilometers of which were stone-paved, permanent highways. These roads had names, functions, and meticulous maintenance schedules. Some were built by soldiers as part of their service, others by local municipalities under obligation to the central government. Roads like Via Appia, Rome to Brundisium, known as the Queen of Roads. It connected Rome to its southern ports, Via Egnatia, across the Balkans, linking western and eastern territories across Greece and Macedonia, Via Augusta, Spain, stretching from the Pyrenees to Cadiz, vital for moving goods across Hispania. Construction was layered, a gravel base, topped with stones, sometimes crowned with a curb or drainage channel. The engineers followed natural terrain but enforced directness. Where a hill rose, they carved into it. Where a valley lay, they built up ramps or bridges. These weren't just roads. They were statements, permanent, predictable, insistent on movement and control, but they were also surprisingly ordinary. If you had walked them in 100 CE, you wouldn't have found grandeur. You would have found dust, animal droppings, and the creaking of wagon wheels. The power of Rome lay not in spectacle but in consistency. Mule trains and market days. The average Roman road was not filled with armies. It was filled with carts of wheat from North Africa, amphorae of wine from Gaul, olive oil sealed in ceramic jars, fabric, dyes, tools, and iron from every corner of the empire. Trade was the quiet heartbeat of Roman power, and much of it moved not in grand caravans but in small groups. Mule trains, ox-drawn wagons, or individual porters carrying burdens strapped to wooden frames. In the provinces, particularly in Gaul, Hispania, and Britannia, the roads were dotted with mansiones, state-run inns for officials, and mutationes, where travelers could change animals or rest. Alongside these, private tabernae, taverns, and stabulum stables served merchants and commoners. Many of these travelers followed weekly circuits, planned around local market days. A muleteer might leave Narbo, modern Narbonne, with saltfish, and arrive in Nemausus, Nemus, in 3 days. A farmer might time his trip to the next town's Nundinai, or 8-day market cycle, bringing surplus grain to trade for tools or fabric. A scribe from a provincial office might carry a stack of tax receipts to the governor's mansion for monthly audit. These were not dramatic journeys, but multiplied by thousands, they became the bloodstream of empire. Weighing the load, Roman carts had limits. Roads had gradients. Bridges had regulations. So the empire devised standards. Wheel widths were regulated to prevent ruts. Load weights were restricted by road class. Some roads could handle fully laden wagons, others only animals or foot traffic. Toll checkpoints enforced compliance, especially near bridges or border crossings. One surviving edict from Trajan's reign lays out axle-size minimums for state wagons, likely to prevent cheating by overloading and damaging roads. And then there were the tax collectors. Along the roads, stations, small administrative outposts, recorded movements of goods. These posts, run by the cursus publicus, state courier system, helped enforce trade duties, monitor smuggling, and sometimes even conscript goods or animals for state use. Travel wasn't just movement, it was regulation. And so a merchant's day might involve not just the road, but a stamped travel permit, a toll payment based on weight, a night spent waiting for official inspection to be completed, all slow, all tedious, but all part of a system that stretched from Britannia to Syria. Roads in winter, not all roads were equal. And not all seasons were kind. In the wet months, mountain passes became impassable. In Gaul, mud swallowed wheels and exhausted animals. In Dacia, snow cut off entire regions for weeks. In Egypt, desert roads were usable year-round, but water availability dictated travel time. Some road sections had seasonal alternates, marked by milestone inscriptions. Others relied on local guides whose knowledge of terrain, inns, and hazards was essential. Weather, in this system, was not an anomaly. It was a factor baked into the schedule. And so a military courier might be delayed not by war, but by a washed-out bridge. A tax shipment might be rerouted through a longer path because of early thaw in the Alps. And a poor muleteer might spend an extra 2 nights in a tavern, waiting for passable conditions to return. No grand catastrophe, just the slow, creeping inevitability of time and nature. The empire without maps. One of the more curious facts about Roman roads is this: they didn't use maps, at least not in the way we think of them. Instead, travelers relied on itineraria, strip style, lists of distances and stops. A traveler from Rome to Capua might carry a scroll that read something like, from Rome to Aricia, 16 miles, Aricia to Tres Tabernae, 18 miles, Tres Tabernae to Formiae, 19 miles. No topography, no curves, just stations and mileage. And yet, it worked, because the roads themselves were anchored in the real world, with milestones, every Roman mile, signs, and the slow regularity of travel, where one could ask for directions in a tongue shared across legions of villagers, guards, and vendors. The road as memory. By now you may be sensing the rhythm. Roman roads were not monuments. They were methods. They were the practical glue that held grain to granary, merchant to market, tax to treasury. They were built, maintained, walked, and rarely thought of. Yet they shaped the very limits of Roman identity. A man from Gaul, walking the Via Domitia to Massilia, might feel himself on Roman ground not because of Latin or laws, but because the stones beneath his sandals bore the mark of the same empire as the stones near the Tiber. That is how power lasted, not through orders shouted across provinces, but through 1,000 quiet journeys made by people with names lost, to history carrying salt, tools, scrolls, and oil, not with glory, with routine. And as we pause here, on a worn stretch of the Via Appia, the dust settling behind a mule cart headed south, we might wonder what happens to an empire when its roads fall silent. The roads of Rome were more than corridors for merchants and muleteers. Beneath their dust and cobblestone, they were arteries of command. They allowed the empire not just to feed itself or trade, but to control, to react to rebellion, to move troops with speed, to spread ideas, and to enforce taxes with quiet precision. The Roman Empire was large, stretching from the moors of northern Britannia to the sands of Arabia, from the rivers of Germania to the forests of Thrace. For such a diverse and sprawling collection of provinces, Consistency and reach mattered more than grandeur, and so the road became a tool of administration, as vital to Rome's survival as legions or laws. This section walks through how that tool worked. The March of the Legions. When Rome conquered a new region, it did not immediately establish palaces or statues. It sent in engineers and road builders. Military roads were often the first constructions in newly annexed territories. The Via Militaris, for example, ran through the Balkans, connecting the Central Empire to the Danube frontier. The Via Claudia Augusta threaded northward into Alpine regions. Legions needed to move, and not just march. They needed to march with order, speed, and supplies. A Roman legion on the move wasn't a ragtag group. It was a mobile city, 5,000, 6,000 soldiers, organized by cohort and century, a long baggage train of mules, oxen, and wagons, portable forges, camp tools, and even collapsible fortification materials. Engineers and surveyors to assess road conditions or make temporary bridges. With a good road, a Roman legion could cover 15 to 20 miles per day in hostile territory, an astonishing feat compared to the average travel of civilian traffic, which was half that at best. This capacity was not theoretical. It enabled Rome to respond to uprisings quickly. When Boudica rebelled in Britannia in 60 CE, Governor Suetonius Paulinus marched his forces along Roman roads to confront her forces. Though outnumbered, the speed and cohesion of movement contributed to the Roman victory. A road, then, was a force multiplier. It allowed fewer troops to cover more ground and appear where they were least expected. Forts and way stations, the empire's checkpoints, scattered across the empire. At regular intervals along important roads lay the castra, Roman forts. These weren't just military barracks. They were logistical centers. Each fort along a road could house detachments, store supplies, receive reports, and monitor movement. Some were permanent stone complexes. Others were timber and earthworks, maintained for decades and rebuilt as needed. In between these forts, smaller stations and mutations existed. These served the cursus publicus, Rome's state courier and transportation system. Through it, Rome maintained a level of communication unmatched until modern times. A government courier could arrive at a mutatio, exchange horses, hand off the scroll or package, and continue along his route, all at state expense. These couriers bore a diploma, a kind of passport and travel order, which allowed them to requisition fresh mounts and even food and lodging. Messages traveled across the empire in days, not weeks. From Rome to Londinium, about 6 to 8 days by fast courier. From Rome to Antioch, about 10 to 12 days. From Rome to Carthage, 3 days by ship, then 2 more overland. Such timing allowed the emperor to send orders, receive updates, and even conduct legal hearings by proxy across thousands of kilometers. For the average citizen, this meant living in a province where imperial will could reach you swiftly, even without armies. Roads and the taxman taxes paid for the empire's roads, and roads made it easier to collect taxes. Provinces were assessed not only by land but by goods in motion. Roads allowed harvests and manufactured items to reach imperial storage points and markets. In turn, they allowed officials to travel to towns, review tax registers, and ensure compliance. In Egypt, grain bound for Rome moved via road and river, from the Nile Delta to the ports of Alexandria, then by ship across the Mediterranean. The road portion of this journey, though short, was vital and maintained with extreme care. Disruptions could mean empty granaries in Rome. In Gaul, a surveyor might inspect farm yields and record them for taxation. His route would follow paved Roman roads to minimize delays. In Judea, after the first Jewish revolt, Rome expanded roadways and established military roads not just for control, but for tax enforcement, enabling the efficient collection of tribute and grain. The roads enabled the movement of inspectors, clerks, scribes, and guards, the unsung bureaucrats who kept the gears of empire turning. The quiet war of paperwork. We often imagine ancient history in swords and sandals, but the Roman Empire was as much a paper empire as it was a military one. On its roads moved scrolls, contracts, orders, records, petitions, and censuses. The imperial postal system didn't just send messages. It carried evidence of law and administrative intent. Roman citizens could appeal to higher courts, even to the emperor himself. A village dispute in North Africa might be sent by scroll to Rome for adjudication, and all of this paper moved on foot, on hoof, or in wagons, through the physical infrastructure of roads. Each step taken by a courier meant the continuation of legal identity, of recorded history, and of imperial cohesion. Roads of culture and faith. But the roads carried more than commerce and control. They carried ideas. Philosophers, teachers, playwrights, and artisans all moved with relative ease across the empire. Latin and Greek coexisted in towns connected by road. Architectural styles, agricultural techniques, and even religious practices spread in quiet waves along trade routes. Consider, the spread of early Christianity was deeply dependent on Roman roads. Paul of Tarsus, for example, traveled the Via Egnatia and other routes during his missions. Local deities became syncretized with Roman gods as worshippers and priests moved between towns. Military veterans settled in colonies across the empire, bringing Roman customs to places as far-flung as Thrace and North Africa. The road was the canvas upon which cultural blending occurred. Trouble on the tracks. As the empire entered its later centuries, signs of strain appeared. Not just in politics, but in road maintenance. The burden of upkeep fell increasingly on local municipalities and landlords. In some areas, funds were diverted, milestones left unrepaired, and tolls increased. This affected more than comfort. It slowed logistics. Military reinforcements took longer. Grain arrived late. Communication stuttered. And as roads deteriorated, banditry increased, especially in less patrolled provinces. The safety of the road, once a given under Roman law, became a risk calculation. Some wealthy travelers began hiring guards. Others simply stopped traveling altogether unless necessary. The connective tissue of empire was beginning to fray. The memory of distance, even as decline set in, the roads remained. In fact, many of Europe's modern highways follow ancient Roman paths. The A1 Autostrada in Italy, for instance, traces the Via Flaminia. The French Route Nationale 7 overlays parts of the Via Agrippa. Long after emperors fell, the roads persisted. In some villages, farmers tilled fields crossed by buried stones of Roman origin. In others, milestones were broken up and repurposed as church steps or foundation blocks. To walk these paths today is to walk the ghost of an administration, slow, deliberate, and obsessed with order. And as we near the end of this section, we are left with a question. When the empire lost its roads, did it lose the empire itself? By the time the 5th century arrived, the Roman Empire no longer bore the shape it once held. The Western Empire, fractured and fading, saw its legions withdrawn, its officials replaced by local warlords, and its system of governance gradually eroded. But while the emperors fell, something else lingered. The roads, built of crushed gravel and volcanic stone, reinforced with lime mortar, and laid with tireless precision. Roman roads were not easy to forget. They could weather storms, frost, and time. Long after the imperial eagle ceased to fly, these routes remained etched across the landscape, silent monuments to order in a crumbling world. But what became of them? Who walked these roads after the empire's fall? What was carried? Who kept them open, and why do we still trace them today? A fractured map. Roads in the early Middle Ages. As Roman administration receded, so too did centralized maintenance of infrastructure. Roads fell under local control, if they were maintained at all. Without imperial funding or state-backed engineers, road upkeep became a patchwork affair, dependent on monasteries, bishops, local lords, or communities of travelers. Yet despite this, the roads did not vanish. Travel did not cease with the empire's collapse. It merely changed shape. Instead of military supply lines and imperial couriers, the roads now bore pilgrims journeying to holy sites like Santiago de Compostela or Rome itself, itinerant monks and missionaries spreading Christian doctrine across pagan frontiers, local traders exchanging cheese for salt, cloth for grain, bandits taking advantage of lawless regions to prey upon the unwary. The road had transformed from a channel of imperial command into a winding thread of survival and devotion. In many places, monasteries became the new guardians of the road. These spiritual centers, often located near old Roman routes, offered hospitality to travelers, lodging, food, and occasionally security. A monk copying manuscripts in a candlelit scriptorium might never leave his cloister, yet his abbey stood beside the same stones once marched upon by Caesar's legions. From legions to pilgrims, the rise of the sacred road, one of the most significant transformations of Roman infrastructure, came with the rise of pilgrimage. By the 8th century, long-distance religious travel had become a defining feature of European spiritual life. Pilgrims walked routes that often still bore Roman foundations. The Via Francigena, once a key Roman route to Gaul, became the main pilgrimage road to Rome from Canterbury. The Via Domitia, running from Italy to Spain through southern Gaul, became a corridor for both trade and piety. The Via Augusta, leading from Tarragona to Cadiz in Hispania, continued to link towns and markets centuries after Rome's departure. These roads, though battered and narrowed by time, still connected shrines, relics, and holy places. Along them rose new settlements, hostels, and chapels, medieval infrastructure layered over ancient foundations. The road was no longer about conquest. It was about penance, hope, and faith. Cartwheels and crown control, the medieval kingdoms. Adapt as medieval kingdoms gradually solidified, Frankish, Anglo-Saxon, Carolingian, the usefulness of Roman roads became undeniable once more. Kings understood that control required movement, and movement required roads. Charlemagne, for instance, issued edicts to maintain roads and bridges in the late 8th century. He recognized the strategic value of inherited Roman infrastructure in governing his vast multi-ethnic realm. Yet without the centralized might of imperial Rome, medieval rulers had to reinvent governance. Rather than a vast bureaucratic road system, Europe saw the rise of customs posts, bridge tolls, and feudal control points. Travelers were often subject to multiple tolls in a single journey, paying one lord to use a bridge, another to pass through a forest, a third to enter a market town. While Roman roads had been arteries of unity, medieval usage fragmented them into slices of jurisdiction, yet the stones still held firm. In some towns, especially in Italy and southern France, Roman paving stones were still in daily use. Carts and wagons bounced along rutted surfaces laid down over 1,000 years earlier. Farmers knew which ancient paths stayed dry in spring floods. Traders adjusted their pack routes to follow the remnants of Rome's vision. The silent engineers, rediscovery, and the Renaissance. By the 14th century, Europe was awakening once more. The Renaissance brought renewed interest in classical antiquity, not just in art and philosophy, but in engineering and infrastructure. Scholars pored over surviving Roman texts like Vitruvius' De Architectura. Engineers walked the ancient roads, studied the ruins of aqueducts, and sought to understand the genius behind them. City planners in Florence, Venice, and Milan looked to Roman urban design as a model for rational layout and movement. The idea that a well-ordered road network could support commerce, defense, and civic pride gained traction again. Maps began to show old Roman roads in more detail. Antiquarians collected milestone inscriptions. A growing sense of historical continuity emerged, Not merely admiration for the past, but a desire to reclaim its function. Roads once neglected were now studied. Still, these were intellectual pursuits. The real revival of the road as infrastructure would wait until the pressures of nation-building and industrial growth returned in full force in the 17th and 18th centuries. Stones beneath asphalt. The modern legacy, even in the age of asphalt. Engine oil and rubber tires, the Roman road remains with us. Modern highways in Italy, France, and Britain often follow the exact alignments of Roman routes, chosen centuries ago not for whimsy, but because they were logical, efficient, and enduring. Consider, the A6 autoroute in France traces the Via Agrippa, connecting Lyon to the north. The Watling Street in Britain, once a Roman trunk road, is still marked by portions of the modern A2 and A5 highways. The Via Appia, now partially covered in cobblestone and surrounded by cypress trees, remains a walking route for tourists and pilgrims alike. In fact, infrastructure historians use satellite imagery and archaeological data to track Roman road alignments across Europe. Even where stone has vanished, the ghosts of roads remain visible in land formations, hedgerows, and farm divisions. Beneath the hum of a speeding car on a rural French road may lie 2,000 years of history, layered beneath asphalt, packed into the earth, silently supporting the future. The road is memory. At the heart of this story is a simple truth. A road is not just a way from A to B. It is a statement of intent, a promise of return, and a claim of control. Rome built roads not just to conquer, but to last. Each stone laid was an assertion that here, law would reach, goods would move, and life would continue. When we speak of Rome as an empire, we often picture statues, legions, or emperors, but perhaps the truest symbol of Rome's genius lies not in its palaces but in its pavement, because even in decay the Roman road endured. It endured through darkness and revival, faith and fear, kings and merchants, pilgrims and peasants, and, as you drift gently to sleep, consider this. If a civilization can be measured not by its monuments but by the roads it leaves behind, what are we building that will still be walked upon in 2,000 years? End of story 3. Salt roads and mule trains. How Roman trade routes paved the way for empires. Would you like to move on to story 4? I can begin with the title and section 1 immediately. Imagine a small medieval town after sunset. The sun dips below the horizon and shadows deepen in narrow alleys. No street lamps glow. The only light comes from the flickering hearths inside homes or from the occasional torch carried by a patrolling figure. Before modern police forces existed, towns depended on a more informal but essential group. The night watchmen. These watchmen were the quiet, tireless protectors of the sleeping townsfolk. Their job was neither glamorous nor easy, but it was vital for survival. They were the human alarm system for dangers such as fires, theft, riots, or marauding bandits. This section will explore who these watchmen were, how their duties evolved from Roman and Anglo-Saxon traditions, and what life looked like for the men and sometimes women tasked with guarding the fragile peace of medieval streets after dark. Imagine a medieval town as twilight falls. The sun slips beneath the horizon. The sky darkens and the narrow winding streets become cloaked in shadow. There are no streetlights, no glowing neon signs, no security cameras silently watching from corners. The only illumination comes from flickering torches held by the watchmen, or from the faint glow of hearth fires visible through windows. In this world, when the last shop shutter closed and the markets emptied, a different kind of duty began, the watchman's patrol. These men, and occasionally women, were the town's first line of defense against the dangers lurking in the dark. They were a humble, largely uncelebrated group, but without them, the night might have been a far more perilous place. Origins. From Roman vigils to Anglo-Saxon watchers, the idea of a night watchman is older than the medieval town itself. The ancient Romans had the vigiles urbani, a corps of nighttime guards who patrolled the streets of Rome to prevent fires and crime. The vigils carried buckets, axes, and whistles, and their responsibilities ranged from firefighting to enforcing curfews. After the fall of Rome, much of this institutional knowledge dissipated but did not vanish entirely. In Anglo-Saxon England, communities organized their own forms of watch duty. Men in villages and emerging towns would take turns standing guard at night, looking out for thieves, fire, or hostile neighbors. This communal responsibility was often formalized through local laws and customs. For example, the Assize of Arms, a series of 12th century English laws, required all able-bodied men to keep arms and to participate in watches. This system ensured that towns had a rotating force of individuals responsible for night security. By the late medieval period, this communal system had evolved into a more professionalized watch. Men employed or appointed specifically to guard the town through the night. These watchmen were often selected for their trustworthiness or experience, and sometimes received small wages or other forms of compensation. Daily life of a watchman. What was it like to be a watchman? The job was far from glamorous and fraught with challenges. Typically, watchmen worked in shifts throughout the night, covering designated sections of the town. They carried basic equipment: a lantern or torch for illumination, a staff or cudgel for self-defense, sometimes a whistle or horn to signal danger, a bell to alert the town or call assistance. Their patrols were methodical. Walking along the walls, markets, and streets, they checked doors and windows, watched for signs of fire, and listened for unusual noises. At regular intervals, they would announce the time by calling out the hour or beating their staff on the ground. This helped maintain order and assured citizens that the watch was active. The watchman's responsibilities extended beyond crime prevention. Fire was a constant threat in medieval towns, where buildings were tightly packed and made mostly of wood and thatch. A single spark could lead to disaster. Watchmen had to be vigilant, ready to raise the alarm and rally townsfolk to fight fires. Despite the risks, the job was poorly paid and the work was often lonely and tiring. Many watchmen were older men, past their prime for heavy labor, or individuals without other means of support. The challenges of darkness and disorder. Night presented particular challenges. Without streetlights, watchmen had to rely on limited light sources, making it easier for criminals to hide. The risk of ambush was real, and some watchmen carried weapons primarily for self-defense. Criminals exploited darkness to steal goods, pick pockets, or break into homes. Watchmen had to be alert and sometimes confrontational, but they also had to avoid escalating situations into violence unnecessarily. In some towns, local authorities supplemented watchmen with town criers or constables who could organize swift responses to incidents. However, in many places, a watchman's shout or bell was the only warning the town had. Legal authority and limitations. Watchmen had limited legal authority. They could detain suspects temporarily, but often had to hand them over to local magistrates or sheriffs for formal prosecution. In some cases, the watchmen themselves were responsible for minor punishments like fines or public shaming. Their authority varied depending on the size and governance of the town. Larger cities might have more organized forces, while small towns relied heavily on voluntary or poorly compensated watchmen. As the night deepened, you might hear the watchman's call echo faintly across the silent streets, a reminder that even in the dark, someone was keeping vigil. Their work ensured that ordinary people could sleep with some measure of safety. But as towns grew and crime evolved, could these early watch systems keep pace? Would the watchman's role change or fade with time? What forces would shape the emergence of the more formalized police systems in the centuries to come? As dawn broke over the medieval town, the night watchman's torch flickered low and his shift came to an end. The quiet patrols of the previous centuries had changed slowly but significantly, shaped by the growing complexity of medieval urban life. The humble watchman, once a rotating communal duty or poorly paid guard, began evolving into a more formal and structured figure. The constable. This section explores how medieval towns adapted their systems of nighttime security to meet new demands. We will look at the rise of constables and sheriffs, the introduction of new tools and techniques, and the shifting relationship between local communities and the authority that kept order after dark. The growing burden of law and order. By the 13th and 14th centuries, Europe's towns and cities were swelling. Populations grew, markets thrived, and with economic opportunity came a rise in crime, theft, fraud, riots, and even organized banditry. The informal night watch system struggled to meet these challenges. Rotating shifts of part-time watchmen were no longer sufficient to patrol expanding streets and busy marketplaces. Local authorities, town councils, guilds, and nobles responded by professionalizing the night watch. This was the beginning of a shift from a loosely organized community defense to a proto-police force. Enter the constable. The constable originally meant a royal officer responsible for the king's horses, but by the medieval period, the title had broadened to signify a town or village official charged with maintaining order. Constables often took over the duties of the night watchman, but wielded greater authority. They could arrest suspects and detain them, summon the townsfolk for assistance, enforce curfews and local laws, organize patrols, and coordinate watchmen. In some towns, the constable was elected by the community. In others, appointed by a lord or municipal government. Their power and responsibility varied widely depending on location and period. Constables typically carried badges or staffs as symbols of office. They were often respected or feared figures in the community, acting as both peacekeepers and enforcers. Tools of the trade, bells, beacons, and regulations. As cities expanded, the night watch gained new tools beyond torches and staffs. Bells and horns, used to signal emergencies such as fires or attacks and to call for backup. Watchtowers and lookouts, elevated points where guards could survey the town for fires or suspicious activity. Watch books, early record-keeping tools, where constables logged incidents, arrests, and patrol times, a precursor to modern police reports. Curfew laws, mandated times for shutting doors and extinguishing fires to reduce risks and limit the movement of potentially dangerous individuals after dark. These innovations represented an early form of institutional control over the night, emphasizing order through rules and surveillance. The social role of watchmen and constables. The job was still difficult. Many watchmen and constables were poor or working-class men, sometimes reluctantly fulfilling their duties. They faced threats from criminals, hostile townsfolk, and sometimes even rival factions within their own communities. Yet, they were essential. In an age before reliable street lighting, alarm systems, or rapid communication, they were the eyes and ears of the town after dark. Sometimes their role extended beyond protection into social mediation. Constables could be arbiters of disputes or organizers of public punishment, reinforcing social norms through visible enforcement. Night watch and the law. The birth of early policing. The evolution of watchmen into constables laid the groundwork for later policing institutions. Over time, towns added more layers of law enforcement. Night watch became a formalized group working under constables. Sheriffs or bailiffs took on judicial and enforcement roles. Guilds and merchant associations sometimes organized their own guards to protect property and trade routes. By the 16th century, many European cities had permanent watch forces patrolling streets, armed with pikes or halberds, funded by taxes or levies. These early police forces were far from perfect, often understaffed, prone to corruption, and limited by the technology of their time, but they reflected a growing recognition that maintaining peace required dedicated, organized effort. Challenges in a changing world. Despite improvements, watchmen and constables struggled with new realities. The rise of organized crime in port cities, increasing urban poverty leading to vagrancy and petty theft, the complexity of jurisdictional authority, as towns, nobles, and kings often claimed overlapping rights. Corruption and bribery were ongoing concerns. Sometimes watchmen were accused of colluding with criminals or ignoring offenses. Nevertheless, these roles persisted because towns simply could not afford to be unprotected. The very fabric of medieval urban life depended on some measure of security, even if imperfect. Questions for the future as you consider the long, often tedious hours these men spent pacing cobbled streets, calling the time, and watching for fire or thief. It is natural to wonder, how did these early forms of night watch influence the modern police forces we know today? What lessons from medieval watchmen's limitations shaped reforms in law enforcement? Could the challenges of corruption, insufficient funding, and divided authority from centuries ago still be relevant in our current systems? As the medieval period waned and Europe stepped into the early modern age, the once humble night watchman had transformed into a more structured and professional force, setting the foundations for modern policing. This final section traces the gradual shift from informal watch duties to organized police systems, highlighting the successes, challenges, and enduring legacies of these early guardians of the night. The rise of professional watch forces. By the 17th century, many towns had recognized the need for a reliable and consistent security presence after dark. The transition from loosely organized watches to professional night guards reflected both urban growth and increasing demands on public safety. Cities like London created formal watch systems staffed by paid watchmen, often recruited from the local population. These watchmen wore uniforms or badges, carried weapons such as halberds or swords, and were expected to patrol assigned areas methodically through the night. Their duties expanded beyond mere observation to include arresting suspects, investigating disturbances, and sometimes even providing escorts for travelers and merchants. Although still limited by the era's technology and legal frameworks, these forces embodied a more organized approach to urban safety. The impact of social and political changes. Several broader social and political shifts influenced the evolution of night watchmen into police forces. Centralization of state power. Monarchies sought greater control over their cities and territories, often instituting official law enforcement bodies to extend royal authority. Urbanization. Growing cities with dense populations demanded more sophisticated public order systems. Legal reforms. The development of more complex legal codes required law enforcement capable of enforcing increasingly detailed laws. Technological advances. Improved communication methods and infrastructure supported coordinated responses to crime and emergencies. From watchmen to modern police. Key innovations. The evolution did not happen overnight. The watchman's role gradually blended with that of constables, bailiffs, and sheriffs, and later influenced the development of dedicated police forces. Record keeping. The use of logs and reports became more systematic, allowing for better tracking of crimes and patrols. Patrol techniques. The beat system, regular patrol routes assigned to officers, was refined from watchmen's traditional rounds. Public accountability. New oversight mechanisms emerged to curb corruption and improve efficiency. Community relations. Police forces sought to balance enforcement with maintaining public trust, echoing the watchman's historic role as familiar neighborhood figures. The famous establishment of the London Metropolitan Police in 1829 by Sir Robert Peel is often considered a turning point, but its roots lie deep in these medieval and early modern traditions. Legacy and reflection. The silent patrols of the medieval watchmen, their steady footsteps echoing through darkened streets, may seem far removed from today's high-tech policing. Yet, Their legacy endures in the basic principles of public safety, vigilance, community presence, and the tireless commitment to order. Their story is not just about crime prevention, but also about the everyday struggle to maintain a fragile peace amid uncertainty. They remind us that much of history's quiet resilience comes from ordinary people, performing seemingly mundane tasks that nonetheless hold society together. As we close this chapter on the watchmen who guarded medieval towns through the night, consider this: the challenges of balancing authority and community trust, of managing limited resources, and of adapting to changing social conditions are as relevant now as they were centuries ago. What might the future hold for public safety and security? And how will the lessons from these early guardians of the night continue to shape our collective approach to law and order? Would you like to begin story 5? How ancient farmers transformed the wilderness. The slow growth of agriculture. Imagine a world over 10,000 years ago, long before the hustle of cities or the roar of machines. Instead, there are vast stretches of untamed wilderness, forests dense with towering trees, grasslands dotted with wild grains, and rivers teeming with fish. For thousands of years, humans lived as hunter-gatherers, moving across these landscapes in search of wild plants and animals to sustain themselves. But then something remarkable began to happen. Groups of people started to experiment with planting seeds, nurturing certain plants, and intentionally cultivating food. This slow, quiet shift from foraging to farming would reshape human history forever. Imagine a world more than 10,000 years ago, before cities, kingdoms, or roads. The land is wild and sprawling. Dense forests where sunlight barely touches the ground. Meadows thick with grasses and rivers winding lazily through the landscape. People lived here as hunter-gatherers, moving with the seasons, gathering wild fruits, roots, and nuts, and hunting animals for survival. Their lives were shaped by the rhythms of nature. They had deep knowledge of plants and animals, learned from generations of observation, yet they did not farm. Food was taken from the land in its wild form, without deliberate planting or cultivation. Then, in scattered places across the globe, most notably in the Fertile Crescent of the Near East, a quiet but profound change began. People started to select and plant wild grains. They began managing plants to produce more reliable harvests. The shift from foraging to farming was gradual, slow, and uneven. This first section explores how early humans began the transition to agriculture, the techniques they developed, and the environmental and social conditions that shaped this revolution. The environment before farming. The late Pleistocene epoch, the world's last ice age, was drawing to a close. The climate was warming, glaciers retreating, and landscapes transforming. In many regions, forests expanded, and grasslands shifted. Wild cereals such as barley and wheat grew naturally in the Near East's river valleys and foothills. These wild grains, along with legumes and nuts, were part of the hunter-gatherer diet. People harvested them by hand, often using simple tools like flint sickles or digging sticks. However, yields were unpredictable, dependent on weather, animal interference, and seasonal cycles. Early experiments with cultivation. The first farmers likely began by managing wild plants rather than planting from scratch. They may have cleared small patches of land, weeded unwanted species, or selectively harvested seeds from the best plants. Over generations, this process led to gradual domestication. Plants became larger, less bitter, and easier to harvest. Evidence from archaeological sites like Jericho and Çatalhöyük shows early storage pits for surplus grain and rudimentary tools for farming. These suggest a slow move toward food production rather than mere gathering. Tools and techniques. The first agricultural implements. Early farming did not require sophisticated technology. Tools were adapted from hunting and gathering, including flint sickles for cutting grasses and cereals, grinding stones for processing grains into edible flour, digging sticks to prepare soil for planting, simple fire use to clear fields and control pests. The invention of pottery also played a role, enabling storage of surplus food, which in turn encouraged sedentary life and larger populations. Social and cultural shifts. Farming required a shift not only in technology but in social organization. Staying in one place to tend crops encouraged permanent settlements. This led to more complex social structures, with divisions of labor and emerging leadership roles. The risks also changed. Farming tied people to the land, but made them vulnerable to droughts, pests, or crop failures. Communities developed storage methods and shared labor to cope with uncertainty. The puzzle of why farming began. Why did humans begin farming at all? Scholars debate whether environmental pressures, population growth, or cultural factors played the primary role. Some theories propose that warming climates made wild grains more abundant, encouraging planting. Others suggest that population pressure forced people to find more reliable food sources. Whatever the cause, the slow shift to agriculture marks one of humanity's most important transformations. As you reflect on this quiet revolution, seed by seed, field by field, consider the immense patience and experimentation required to turn wild plants into reliable crops. How did these early farmers cope with failure and uncertainty? What social changes did cultivating the land set in motion? As you continue to think about those earliest farmers carefully tending their plots of wild wheat and barley, it's important to recognize that this shift from foraging to farming was neither quick nor universal. The slow spread of agriculture across different regions brought with it a host of challenges, adaptations, and cultural shifts. This section delves into how farming expanded beyond its origins, the obstacles early cultivators faced, and how human resilience helped shape diverse agricultural practices. The geographic spread of agriculture, the birthplace of farming in the UAE, Fertile Crescent, modern-day Iraq, Syria, and Turkey, soon saw the practice spreading outward over millennia. From there, agriculture diffused into Europe via the Balkans and Mediterranean coasts, North Africa along the Nile River, South Asia where early domestication of rice and millet began, China with its own centers of grain cultivation, and eventually into the Americas with independent domestications of maize, beans, and squash. Each region adapted farming techniques to its unique climate, soil, and native plants, leading to a mosaic of agricultural systems. Environmental and climatic challenges. Early farmers often worked in environments that could be unforgiving. Unpredictable rainfall could destroy crops. Soil fertility sometimes declined with repeated planting. Pests and diseases affected plants and livestock. Seasonal cycles demanded precise timing of planting and harvesting. Unlike foragers who could move to find food, farmers were tied to their fields and vulnerable to local environmental changes. To cope, early agricultural communities developed. Innovations such as irrigation systems diverting water from rivers to fields, crop rotation and fallowing to preserve soil nutrients, storage pits and granaries to stockpile surplus harvests against famine, selective breeding of plants and animals for hardiness and yield, social transformations and community cooperation. Agriculture required cooperation. Fields needed tending. Irrigation canals had to be maintained and surpluses managed. These necessities spurred more complex social organizations. The rise of village councils or elders to coordinate communal labor. Emergence of specialized awe roles such as farmers, toolmakers, and traders. Development of rituals and religious beliefs tied to planting and harvest cycles, reinforcing social cohesion. Property concepts began to form as land became valuable, and ownership disputed. These changes laid the groundwork for the rise of towns and cities centuries later. Health and lifestyle changes. Although farming provided more stable food supplies, it came with costs. Dietary diversity decreased as staples like wheat or rice replaced varied wild foods. Increased reliance on carbohydrates sometimes led to nutritional deficiencies. Living in settled villages encouraged the spread of infectious diseases. Physical labor intensified, with repetitive planting and harvesting tasks. Skeletal remains from early farming communities show signs of both improved survival and new health stresses compared to hunter-gatherers. The resilience of early farmers faced with environmental uncertainties, social pressures, and health challenges. Early farming communities displayed remarkable resilience. They developed adaptive strategies tailored to local conditions. Communities built surplus food stores to buffer bad years. Social rituals helped maintain morale and cooperation. Over time, farming techniques refined, improving yields and sustainability. Unresolved questions about early agriculture. The slow, uneven nature of agricultural adoption raises intriguing questions. Why did some groups adopt farming quickly, while others resisted for thousands of years? How did the balance between foraging and farming shape different societies? What were the gender and age roles in these early agricultural communities? Could lessons from ancient farming resilience inform today's challenges with climate change and food security? As you imagine the daily rhythms of these early farmers, planting, harvesting, storing, and sharing, you glimpse not only the beginnings of settled life, but the dawn of civilization itself. Their persistence, amid hardships, set the stage for the complex societies that would follow. Foundations of civilization. Agriculture's lasting legacy. As you consider the gradual but profound changes early farming brought to human societies, it becomes clear that agriculture was more than just a new way to get food. It was the foundation on which complex civilizations rose, reshaping not only the environment, but social structures, technologies, and human relationships. This final section explores how early agriculture set the stage for towns, states, and empires, and how the humble act of planting seeds transformed the course of history. The birth of permanent settlements with reliable food sources. People could stay in one place longer. Villages grew into towns as populations increased and food surpluses supported specialists, craftsmen, traders, priests, and rulers. Settlements like Çatalhöyük in Anatolia, dated around 7500 BCE, illustrate this shift. Houses were tightly packed, sometimes sharing walls reflecting dense communities. Surplus crops allowed for storage in granaries, ensuring food during lean times. Permanent settlements encouraged the development of infrastructure. Roads and pathways connected homes and marketplaces. Water management systems regulated irrigation and sanitation. Public spaces and temples became centers for communal life and ritual. Social complexity and hierarchies. Agriculture also led to the rise of social hierarchies. Control of land, water, and surplus food became sources of power. Leaders emerged to organize labor, resolve disputes, and defend territory. This concentration of resources fostered class divisions and sometimes led to slavery or serfdom, as some people became dependent on others for sustenance. At the same time, agricultural cycles inspired new religious beliefs and ceremonies, often focused on fertility and the changing seasons, weaving spirituality tightly into daily life. Technological and cultural innovations. The demands of farming spurred many technological advances. The plow, improving soil cultivation, irrigation canals and reservoirs to manage water, improved storage containers and pottery for food preservation, development of writing systems for record-keeping, trade, and laws. These innovations enabled more efficient food production and complex economies. Environmental transformation. Agriculture reshaped landscapes dramatically. Forests cleared to create fields. Soil worked intensively, sometimes leading to erosion. Domesticated plants and animals spread widely, sometimes displacing wild species. While these changes supported growing populations, they also introduced new environmental challenges. Q. Agricultural revolution's enduring impact. The slow growth of farming laid the groundwork for all subsequent human history. Cities, kingdoms, and empires were only possible because people could reliably produce and store surplus food. However, this progress came with trade-offs: social inequality, environmental degradation, and new vulnerabilities to famine and disease. As you reflect on these changes, you might ask, how did the balance between human innovation and environmental limits shape the future of civilizations? What lessons can we draw from ancient farmers who navigated uncertainty and transformed the wilderness, shaping the world we live in today? This quiet but powerful revolution reminds us that the story of agriculture is not just about plants or tools. It is about human resilience, adaptation, and the ongoing negotiation between society and nature. The quiet artisans behind the manuscript's picture a dimly lit workshop somewhere in medieval Europe, where the faint scent of parchment and leather fills the air. A craftsman, call him a bookbinder, sits bent over a simple wooden table, carefully sewing together pages of fragile vellum, smoothing leather covers, and hammering brass clasps. His work is painstaking, repetitive, and painstakingly unglamorous. Yet through these quiet hands, the knowledge of ancient civilizations, religious texts, and scholarly works were preserved, copied, and passed down. This section explores who these medieval bookbinders were, the materials and methods they used, and their essential role in safeguarding human knowledge during centuries often remembered as the Dark Ages. Picture a dimly lit medieval workshop, the air thick with the smell of animal hide, ink, and wood smoke. A craftsman sits at a rough wooden table surrounded by stacks of fragile vellum sheets, spools of linen thread, and blocks of tooled leather. He moves with deliberate care, stitching pages into gatherings, smoothing parchment and binding covers with strips of dyed leather or wooden boards. His work is quiet, repetitive, and often overlooked by the bustling monastery or the grand halls of nobility. Yet without him, the knowledge held within manuscripts, the religious, scientific, philosophical, and literary treasures of the ancient and medieval worlds, would have been lost to time. These men, the medieval bookbinders, were the silent guardians of written knowledge. While the scribes labored to copy texts by hand, it was the binders who assembled these texts into durable books, transforming loose sheets into treasured volumes that could withstand use and passage through generations. Who were the medieval bookbinders? Bookbinding in medieval Europe was rarely a glamorous profession. Most bookbinders worked within monasteries or scriptoria, where monks performed multiple roles, including copying manuscripts, illuminating texts, and binding books. In larger cities, lay craftsmen began to emerge as specialized binders, often part of guilds dedicated to the book trade. These artisans were skilled but rarely credited by name. Their work was seen as craft rather than art, and the focus remained on the manuscript's content rather than its physical form. Yet the quality of their work was crucial. A well-bound book protected delicate pages from moisture, dirt, and damage. Materials and methods. The materials used by bookbinders reflected the resources available and the intended purpose of the book. Parchment and vellum. The pages themselves were made from animal skins, stretched and scraped to create a smooth surface suitable for writing and illumination. Leather covers. Most medieval books were bound in leather, often calf, goat, or pig skin, tanned and dyed. Some wealthy patrons preferred bindings decorated with gold leaf or embossed patterns. Boards. Early bindings often used wooden boards for covers, providing rigidity and protection. Thread and sewing. Linen thread was commonly used to sew gatherings of parchment together, using specific stitching patterns to ensure durability. Clasps and straps. Metal clasps or leather straps helped keep the book closed tightly, protecting the pages and preventing warping. The process was slow and meticulous. Each step required precision to ensure the book would survive frequent handling and the test of time. The role of the bookbinder in knowledge preservation. During the so-called Dark Ages, a period often misunderstood as one of intellectual decline, monasteries and religious houses were the main centers of learning and manuscript production. Bookbinders in these institutions preserved the works of classical authors, religious texts, and emerging scholarly works. Their craft was essential in allowing text to be copied, stored, and circulated. Books were precious commodities, rare and expensive, so preserving their physical integrity was a matter of cultural survival. The challenges of bookbinding in the Middle Ages. The binders faced many challenges. Fragility of materials. Animal skins were sensitive to humidity and temperature. Labor intensity. Binding a single manuscript could take weeks. Limited tools. Medieval tools were basic, requiring patience and skill. Economic constraints. Materials were costly and book production was slow and expensive. Despite these hurdles, the binder's work ensured that texts were usable and transportable, enabling knowledge to reach beyond monastic walls. As you imagine, the careful hands of these forgotten artisans working by candlelight. Consider the sheer patience and precision required to produce a single medieval book. How did the conditions of their workshops affect their work? How did their craft influence who had access to knowledge? Would you like to continue to section 2 of Story 6? We'll explore the evolution of bookbinding techniques, the rise of secular binders in urban centers, and the challenges they faced in a changing world.